My daughter-in-law held out the box without meeting my eyes. Just a flat rectangle wrapped in newspaper, the comics section, like she'd grabbed whatever was closest to the recycling bin. I opened it in front of 40 people at my own retirement dinner. A plastic pen, the kind banks give away for free, with a coffee shop logo already worn off one side. And 2 tables over, on the wrist of a man 26 years old, was the watch I had mentioned wanting for 3 straight Christmases, a Hamilton khaki field, nothing extravagant, just the one thing I'd ever asked for, in 40 years of never asking for anything. She had bought it for him, personally selected it, personally wrapped it in silver paper with a bow, and handed it to him in front of the entire family like a woman crowning a king. The room went quiet the way rooms do when everyone senses something they're not supposed to be watching, and then keeps watching anyway. My son Robert sat 2 seats down from me, staring at his plate. He hadn't looked up once since dinner started. Elaine, my daughter-in-law of 11 years, leaned toward me with a smile that didn't reach anything behind her eyes. "We thought it was fitting," she said. "A pen for your memoirs." Everyone laughed, that nervous cocktail party laugh people do when they're relieved the joke landed on someone else. I laughed too. I held that plastic pen in my hand like it was the finest gift I'd ever received, and I said thank you, and I meant it in a way none of them understood. My name is Walter Hensley. I am 67 years old. I built furniture with these hands for 43 years, ran a small custom cabinetry shop in Council Bluffs, Iowa, that put my son through college and put a roof over more heads than just my own. That night was supposed to be my retirement party. Instead, it was the night I finally understood something I had been refusing to see for 2 years. And before the sun came up the next morning, I was 300 miles away. But I want you to know that I left something behind that night, tucked into the guest room where I'd been staying since my wife passed. Something that would take my son and his wife nearly a month to find, and when they did, neither one of them would ever look at each other the same way again. Stay with me, because what happened in that month changed more than just my life. It changed theirs in ways they never saw coming. But to understand why that plastic pen mattered so much, you have to understand who I was to that family before I became someone they could hand a joke gift to in front of a room full of people. My wife Dorothy died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral. I won't dwell on that because this isn't really her story. But I need you to know that losing her took something out of me that never fully came back. We'd been married 41 years. I didn't know how to exist in a house that quiet. So when Robert and Elaine suggested I sell the house on Poplar Street and move into their guest suite, they called it a suite. It was a converted garage with good insulation. I said yes, before they finished the sentence. I told myself I was doing it for Robert, so he wouldn't worry about his old man alone in a 4-bedroom house with a basement he could fall down the stairs of. The truth is, I said yes because I was terrified of the silence. And my son's house, even a house where I didn't quite belong, had noise in it. Grandchildren. Laughter. Something. I sold the Poplar Street house for $210,000. I gave Robert and Elaine $60,000 of it, no strings. To finish the addition, they'd been wanting a proper mother-in-law suite, instead of the garage conversion, they said. So I'd have my own bathroom, my own door, some dignity. I put the rest in a money market account and told myself I'd leave it to the grandkids' education when the time came. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I still had my pension from the shop, still had Social Security, and at 63 years old with a paid-off truck and simple tastes, I didn't cost anybody a thing. For the first year, it was good. Genuinely good. I fixed things around the house nobody had gotten around to fixing. I picked my granddaughter Mia up from soccer practice 3 days a week, because both of them worked long hours, Robert at the insurance agency and Elaine doing something with marketing I never fully understood no matter how many times she explained it. I made dinner most nights because I was the one home first. I taught my grandson Caleb how to sand a piece of pine until it felt like glass under your palm, the same way my own father taught me in a garage in 1969. I felt useful. I felt, for the first time since Dorothy died, like I still had a place in the world that wasn't just waiting rooms and church potlucks. Somewhere in the second year, something shifted, and like most shifts that matter, I didn't clock it happening in real time. I only recognized it later, the way you recognize a room has gotten cold after you've already been shivering in it for an hour. Elaine's brother Derek started coming around more. He was 26, Elaine's much younger half-brother from her father's second marriage, and he'd moved to town after some falling out with a business partner in Denver that nobody ever fully explained to me. He was between things, was how Elaine put it. Between jobs between apartments, between plans. He started sleeping on their couch for a couple weeks, around the same time the addition on the house finished. That was 14 months before the retirement dinner. He never left. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even now, even after everything. Derek wasn't cruel to me. He was worse than cruel. He was simply unaware I existed as anything other than furniture. He'd walk past me in the kitchen without a word most mornings. He'd eat food I'd bought and cooked without a thank you, without even the reflex of acknowledgement you'd give a waiter. And slowly, so slowly I couldn't have told you the exact week it happened, I watched Elaine begin orbiting him the way you orbit someone you've decided matters more than the people who are simply always there. The pickups from soccer practice went to Derek. The invitation to family dinners on my actual birthday, my birthday, the one on the calendar, got moved a day for what Elaine called scheduling. Except Derek's schedule was, as far as I could tell, entirely empty. I noticed my chair at the dinner table had quietly become his chair, and I'd started sitting at the end near the kitchen without ever consciously deciding to. I noticed how Elaine's voice changed when she spoke to him, warmer, more present, than the flat, functional tone she used with me, the tone you use with a piece of equipment you're grateful works, but don't think about beyond that. I told myself it was generosity. Elaine had always struck me as generous. This was just her taking care of family. And I was family too. So surely there was room for both of us in that generosity. I told myself a lot of things that year. Most of them weren't true, but they were easier to carry than the truth would have been. Robert, my son, was harder to read, and that hurt more than anything Elaine did, because Robert had once been a boy who followed me around the shop, asking to hold every tool before he was tall enough to reach the bench. Robert had become a man who avoided conflict the way some men avoid the sun, instinctively, protectively, at the cost of everything that needed light to grow. He worked long hours. He came home tired. And whatever tension existed in that house between his father and his wife's brother, he simply didn't engage with it, the same way he'd never once, in 11 years, asked Elaine to explain why her family's needs always seemed to arrive at a higher priority than his own father's. I told myself, he's tired. I told myself, he doesn't see it. I told myself he would notice eventually. The way you tell yourself water will eventually reach a boil if you just wait long enough, without ever checking the stove. The retirement dinner was Elaine's idea. I'd sold the shop that spring 43 years. Gone in one signature to a man half my age who wanted the location, not the business, and Elaine insisted on throwing something. A real party, she said. You deserve it, Walter. 40 family members and old shop customers crowded into their backyard under string lights Elaine had ordered special for the occasion. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest that evening, something that had been tight since Dorothy died. I thought, this is what it looks like when you're loved by the people who are supposed to love you. Then came the gifts. Derek's gift came first. Though it wasn't really a gift for Derek, someone had organized a small collection for me, a card everyone signed, $60-some in it, kind words about the shop, about the cabinets I'd built for half the kitchens in town. That part was lovely. I want to say that clearly. That part was real. Then Elaine stood up with the 2 boxes. One for Derek, she framed it as a joke, something about him finally getting a real job soon, but the box wasn't a joke box. It was from a jewelry counter in the mall, wrapped with the kind of care that takes time and thought. Derek opened it, and there it was, the Hamilton khaki field watch, the exact one. I'd mentioned it 3 Christmases, running, not as a demand, just as the honest answer whenever someone asked what I wanted, because I genuinely didn't want much else. And that watch had a plain, honest face that reminded me of my father's old railroad watch, the one that got lost somewhere in the move after Dorothy's funeral. For all the driving lessons, Elaine said, laughing, and everyone laughed with her, because Derek had apparently been teaching Mia to parallel park, a fact I was learning in that exact moment, in front of 40 people, that I hadn't been told about. Then Elaine turned to me. And Walter, we didn't forget you. She reached under the gift table and pulled out the flat package wrapped in newspaper. I opened it. The pen. The free bank pen, with the worn logo. For your memoirs, she said, and the table laughed. And I laughed too, because what else was there to do standing in a backyard full of people who had all just watched exactly what I was worth to this family, measured out in dollars and newspaper, and a joke that wasn't really a joke at all. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than what I did next. I did not feel rage. I felt something colder and more complete than rage. I felt the floor of an entire understanding finally arrive under my feet, an understanding I'd been circling for 14 months without letting myself land on it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't Elaine being thoughtless in a busy week. This was a woman who had quietly, deliberately, over more than a year, recalibrated exactly how much space I was allowed to take up in a family I had helped build the literal roof over. I thanked her. I told her the pen was thoughtful. I meant something by that sentence that she didn't hear at all. The rest of the party moved on around me the way rivers move around a stone. I sat at the end of the table near the kitchen and watched my grandson Caleb, 12 years old now, laughing at something Derek said, and I watched my granddaughter Mia show Derek something on her phone with the easy comfort of someone showing a favorite uncle, and I understood that this hadn't just been happening to me. It had been happening to the children too, a slow redrawing of the map of who mattered in this house, and I had been too grateful for noise, too afraid of silence, to notice the walls closing in around the space I used to occupy. I drove myself home that night, Robert offered, but I told him I was fine, and something in his face told me he was relieved not to have to sit in a car with me. And I let myself into the converted garage that Elaine called a suite, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the light. At 11:40 that night, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Mia, 13 years old, more perceptive than either of her parents gave her credit for. "Grandpa, I'm sorry about the pen. That wasn't okay." I told Mom it was mean and she said I was being dramatic. I sat with that message for a long time. A 13-year-old girl had seen more clearly in one sentence than her parents had managed in 14 months. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay in that guest suite with its good insulation and its own bathroom and its own door, and I thought about the $60,000 I'd handed over without a second thought. The addition it built, the door that was supposed to give me dignity, and had instead become the door to a room I apparently didn't fully belong behind. I thought about Dorothy, about what she would have said if she'd been sitting at that table watching a plastic pen get handed to her husband of 41 years, while a 26-year-old with no job strapped on a watch I'd wanted, since before she got sick. I knew exactly what she would have said, and it wouldn't have been polite. And some small, stubborn part of me that Dorothy had spent 4 decades building finally, quietly, woke back up. At 1 in the morning, I got up and made coffee in the main kitchen, careful not to wake anyone, and I sat at the table that used to be mine and thought clearly, for the first time in over a year, about what I actually knew and what I had simply allowed myself to stop noticing. I knew that Derek had no job, hadn't for the 14 months he'd lived under that roof, and yet somehow always had cash for concert tickets, for a leased car that appeared 6 months in, for the watch on his wrist that Elaine had paid for. I knew Elaine handled the family finances because Robert had told me so once, offhand, years ago, back when we still talked like father and son, instead of like two men who happened to share a surname and a mailing address. I knew because I am a man who built things with his hands for 43 years, and learned along the way to notice when a measurement doesn't add up that something in that house had been quietly bleeding money for over a year, and I had simply never asked where. By 2 in the morning, I was in the small office off the kitchen, the one Elaine used for her marketing work, telling myself I was only looking for a stamp. That was a lie I told myself for about 4 seconds before I stopped pretending. On the desk, in a drawer that wasn't locked because nobody in that house had ever imagined I'd look, was a folder of bank statements. Not mine. The joint account Robert and Elaine shared, and behind it, tucked separately, a second folder, a business account under Elaine's maiden name, something called Larkspur Consulting LLC that I had never once heard mentioned in 14 months of dinners. I am not a man who goes looking for trouble. I want that understood. But once you see the first thread of something, you cannot unsee it. And something in me, something that had been asleep since Dorothy's funeral, was already pulling. The joint account showed monthly transfers $2,000, sometimes $2,500, going out to an account labeled only with a routing number I didn't recognize. 11 months of transfers. Nearly $26,000. The Larkspur consulting account, the one under Elaine's maiden name that Robert had apparently never seen, showed deposits that didn't match any invoices I could find in the folder, and withdrawals that lined up, almost to the dollar, with the timeline of Derek's leased car, Derek's watch, Derek's absence from ever once contributing to a grocery bill in a house he'd lived in rent-free for over a year. I photographed every page with the same careful hands I'd used my whole life to measure twice and cut once. Then I put everything back exactly where I'd found it, because I am, if nothing else, a methodical man, and methodical men do not tip their hand before they understand the whole shape of what they're looking at. I want to be honest about what I felt doing this, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering you at this point in the story. I did not feel like a spy in my own son's house. I felt like a man finally waking up from a 14-month fog, cold water on the face, unpleasant and necessary in equal measure. I went back to my room. I did not sleep. At 5 in the morning, before the light had fully come up over the Iowa flatland outside my window, I packed my truck. Not everything, just my clothes, my tools, the small cedar box that held what remained of Dorothy's jewelry and my father's old letters, the things a man keeps because they are the only proof he was ever really here. I left behind the television Elaine had bought for the guest suite. I left behind the recliner. I left behind, deliberately, on the neatly made bed, an envelope. Inside that envelope was a letter, and copies not originals, copies because I am careful and I am not stupid, of every bank statement I had photographed that night. The letter told them I knew about Larkspur Consulting. It told them I knew about the transfers, about Derek's watch and Derek's car, and 14 months of a man eating at my table and taking money out of an account that also, as it happened, held the last $60,000 I had given this family in good faith. It told them that I had already spoken, that same week before the party, with an attorney in town about updating my will, and that the current version, the one they didn't know I'd already changed, no longer named Robert as sole beneficiary of the education trust I'd been quietly building for Mia and Caleb, but named the children directly, in a trust Elaine could not touch, administered by a bank, not a family member. The letter ended the way I meant it to end. I did not raise my voice once in 14 months. I want you both to understand that silence was never the same thing as not seeing. I hope you finally understand I was never as unaware as you needed me to be. I signed it, simply, Dad. Then I got in my truck and drove north, toward my brother's place on a lake outside Bemidji, Minnesota. 300 miles of empty highway and gray dawn light, and I want to tell you honestly what those first hours felt like, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant. I felt hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. Grief for the family I had believed I still fully belonged to. Grief for the version of Robert who used to hand me tools in that garage. Grief for a year and a half I had spent making myself smaller and smaller in hopes that eventually someone would notice and hand some of that space back to me on their own. My phone stayed off for 2 days. When I finally turned it on, sitting on my brother Earl's dock with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, there were 31 missed calls and over 40 texts, and the pattern of them told the whole story. Before I'd read a single word, the same pattern I imagine happens in every house, where somebody finally stops absorbing what they've been absorbing. Confusion first, then defensiveness. Then, somewhere around message 20, something that finally started to sound like fear. Dad, where are you? Call me back. This isn't funny. Dad, Elaine says you took something from her office. We need to talk about this like adults. Dad, please. Mia won't stop crying. Just call me. That last one, Mia won't stop crying, was the one that made my hands go still on the phone for a long moment. Not because I doubted my own choices, because I understood, sitting on that dock, that whatever came next was never going to be as simple as an old man versus an ungrateful daughter-in-law. There were 2 children in that house who had done nothing wrong except be born into a family where the adults had stopped being honest with each other. And I owed it to them, more than I owed anybody an explanation, to make sure whatever happened next didn't cost them more than it already had. I called Robert back that evening, not Elaine. My son picked up on the first ring, and his voice, when it came, wasn't angry. It was small in a way I hadn't heard since he was maybe 9 years old and had broken a window with a baseball and was waiting for me to open the back door. Dad, what is going on? Elaine's saying you broke into her office and stole financial documents, and I don't understand any of this. I didn't break into anything, Robert. The office door was open, same as it's been open for 14 months. I photographed statements sitting in an unlocked drawer in a house I have every legal right to be in. And I said, and I made myself say it slowly, made myself not soften it the way I'd softened everything for 14 months. I think you should ask your wife what Larkspur Consulting is, and where $26,000 of your joint money went over the last 11 months, before you spend one more minute being angry at me. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. What are you talking about? he finally said. And something in his voice had changed register entirely, gone from defensive to something closer to the sound of a floor giving way beneath a man's feet. I told him, not with satisfaction, though I won't pretend some small, tired part of me didn't feel a kind of grim relief in finally saying it out loud to the one person in that house who deserved to hear it plainly. I told him about the account under his wife's maiden name. I told him about the transfers that lined up with Derek's watch, Derek's leased car, 14 months of a grown man contributing nothing to a household that was quietly funding his entire adult life. I told him I wasn't asking him to believe me. I told him to go look himself, tonight, before anyone had a chance to clean anything up. He called me back 4 hours later. His voice had gone somewhere I'd never heard it go before, flat and hollow, a man reading his own life back to himself from a script he hadn't written. Derek wasn't Elaine's half-brother between jobs. Robert had found, in a shoebox in the closet of what used to be my room, letters, actual paper letters, the kind people write when they're being careful about what ends up in a text message between Elaine and Derek going back nearly 2 years, since well before Derek ever moved in, since before I'd even sold the Poplar Street house. Larkspur Consulting wasn't a business. It was an account Elaine had opened using client invoices she'd inflated at her marketing job, skimming the difference, funneling it through the LLC, and out to Derek in cash and gifts. And the man Robert had been calling his wife's brother for 14 months was, according to a birth certificate Robert found folded into the bottom of that same shoebox, no blood relation to Elaine at all. I let that sit for a moment before I asked the question I already half knew the answer to. "How long, Robert?" 22 months, he said, and then he didn't say anything else for a long time, and neither did I, because there wasn't anything useful left to say into that particular silence. 22 months meant it had started before I'd even moved into that house. It meant the $60,000 I'd handed over so gladly for an addition, for my own door, my own dignity, had been handed to a household that was already, quietly, being hollowed out from the inside by someone Robert had trusted enough to give a key. Robert filed for divorce 3 weeks later. He didn't do it out of vengeance, and I want to be honest about that, because vengeance was never really the shape of what he felt. He did it because a man can absorb a great many things, but he cannot go on sharing a bed with someone who let his own father get handed a pen while a stranger wore his watch, in a scheme that stranger's presence had been quietly funding the entire time. Elaine did not fight the divorce filing itself, but she fought everything else, the custody arrangement, the house, the money that remained. She hired a lawyer from Omaha who specialized, Robert told me later, with something that might have been the first genuinely dark humor he'd managed in weeks, in difficult clients. What she hadn't counted on was that the trust I'd quietly restructured for Mia and Caleb the week before that retirement dinner was airtight, administered by the bank, completely outside her reach no matter how the divorce settled, and that the $26,000 documented in those Larkspur Consulting statements became, once Robert's attorney got involved, not just a marriage-ending discovery, but a fraud case, because inflating client invoices at a marketing firm and funneling the difference through a shell LLC is not merely a betrayal of a husband. It is a felony. And Elaine's employer, once subpoenaed records, made their way into discovery, pursued it as one. Derek disappeared sometime in that third week. No forwarding address. The leased car repossessed within a month once the payments Elaine had been quietly covering stopped arriving. I never spoke to him, not once, in the entire unraveling of it. Some people, I've come to believe, aren't worth the breath it takes to address them directly. Their absence says everything that needs saying. I did not go back to that house. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you listening are waiting for the moment I walk back through that door and everyone finally sees me the way they should have all along, some tidy scene of vindication under string lights. That isn't what happened, and honestly, by the time the dust had settled, I no longer wanted it to happen that way. I stayed at my brother's place on the lake through that whole autumn, helping Earl replace a dock that had been rotting for a decade, sleeping in a guest room that had nothing to prove and nobody to prove it to. Robert came to see me in October, alone, no children, and we sat on Earl's dock with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, the way coffee always seems to go cold in the moments that matter most. I keep asking myself how I didn't see it, he said. 22 months, Dad. I was in that house every day. You weren't looking for it, I told him. Nobody looks for the thing that would break everything they've built their life around. That's not a character flaw, Robert. That's just what hope does to a person's eyes. He was quiet for a while, watching the water. I'm sorry, he finally said. For the pen, for all of it. I saw it happen, and I told myself I was tired. I told myself it wasn't my place to referee. I let you become a guest in your own family, and I didn't even clock it happening. I didn't rush to forgive him in that moment, and I didn't withhold it either. I told him the truth, which is that I understood exactly how a person can watch something happening in slow motion and still fail to name it, because I had done the same thing myself, sitting at the end of that dinner table for 14 months, telling myself it was generosity, telling myself he was just tired, telling myself a dozen small lies that were each individually survivable and collectively cost me almost everything. You don't owe me forgiveness on a schedule, I told him. But I'll tell you what I told myself on that drive up here in the dark. Respect isn't something you can wait for people to hand back to you once they finally notice you're gone. Some people only calculate what they lost after they've already lost it. And by then, it's not really about you anymore. It's about them finally doing the arithmetic they should have done all along. Mia calls me most Sundays now. She's 14, sharper than either of her parents were at that age, and she asked me once, a few months into all of it, whether I was ever going to come back and live near them again. I told her the truth. I told her I loved her, and her brother, more than almost anything left in this world, but that I'd spent 14 months making myself smaller in a house that had quietly stopped seeing me as someone with needs of his own, and that I wasn't in a hurry to hand anyone that particular chance a second time. She said she understood. I believe she does, more than most adults would in her position. I bought a small place of my own that winter, not far from Earl's, a cabin with 2 bedrooms and a workshop out back where I've started building furniture again, slower now, for myself and for whoever wants it, not to fill silence, but because my hands still remember how, and there is something in that memory that feels, at 67, closer to peace than anything I felt in that converted garage with its own door and its own bathroom and none of its own dignity at all. Robert brings the kids up most months. We sit at a table I built myself, out of pine that took the sanding the same way it always has, patient under your palm until it goes smooth. And there is noise in that cabin now, real noise, the kind I was so afraid of losing, that I nearly let myself disappear into a house that had already, quietly, decided how much of me it had room for. This is what that pen taught me, in the end, more than any amount of money or any court filing ever could. Being useful is not the same thing as being valued. You can cook every dinner, drive every carpool, hand over every dollar you have out of love, and still find yourself handed a plastic pen while somebody else wears the one thing you ever asked for, because generosity given freely can be quietly recategorized in someone else's ledger as simply what you're for. The moment you understand that difference is the moment you either keep shrinking to fit the space they've decided to leave you, or you stop, and you let them do the arithmetic of what they actually lost. I'm not angry anymore. I want you to hear that clearly, whoever you are listening to this tonight. I am not telling you this story so you'll be angry on my behalf. I'm telling you because somewhere out there tonight, some other father, some other mother, some other quiet person who has spent years being useful in a house that stopped seeing them is sitting at the end of a table they used to belong at the head of, telling themselves it's nothing, telling themselves they're just tired, telling themselves the same small lies I told myself for 14 months. If that's you tonight, I want you to know you are not invisible. Not to me, and not to the truth of your own worth, even on the nights it feels like nobody else in the room can see it. Tell me, if you would, where you're watching this from tonight, what town, what state, and how many years you've spent being the steady one in a family that maybe stopped noticing. I read every single one, and every single one matters to me more than you'd guess. And if any part of tonight's story sat down next to something you've been quietly carrying yourself, leave me a word in the comments. Just one word is enough. I'll be here. There are more stories coming, the kind that don't flinch from the truth of what families sometimes do to the people who hold them together, and the kind that, I promise you, always land somewhere worth arriving.